Hi everyone, Carl Steele here for English 7501, the literary theory class of Brooklyn College, fall 2022, talking about Jacques Derrida's chapter, The Animal That Therefore I Am, More to Follow, which is part of the book, The Animal That Therefore I Am. This book is a collection of lectures that Derrida gave at a conference in 1997, and it represents a portion of what was the tail end of a very long philosophical career, where in the final parts of his life he turned increasingly to the question of animals. But as he illustrates in the course of this lecture, he'd been thinking about animals really throughout his career, and he provides a kind of resume of all the many, many instances that he talks about them throughout various essays. I'm not going to be talking about that here. I'm going to be talking about some of the things that matter in this essay most to me. So I won't be talking, for example, about the cat, where he talks about coming out of the shower and his cat seeing him naked and his feeling ashamed of his shame over the cat looking at him. And I'm not going to be talking about what he does with Alice in Wonderland or the figure of the chimera, for example, but I will be talking about Jeremy Bentham, about the animot, about Genesis, and especially about the title of the work. But before I get into that, I want to talk a little bit about deconstruction or post-structuralism, the kind of basic features of it. It's called post-structuralism because, in a sense, it came after structuralism, after Levi-Strauss and structural linguistics prior to that, which set up kind of stable structures of meaning, whether linguistically or culturally, to imagine the kind of fundamental oppositions through which culture or language operates, and what Derrida does as he sets these things in motion. Let me illustrate. So the kind of mode of post-structuralism, also known as deconstruction, is to identify a fundamental conceptual binary and to demonstrate how the terms of that binary depend upon each other for meaning. So guest and host, writing and speech, absence and presence, for example. And this so far sounds rather like structuralism. But what Derrida does additionally is to demonstrate that because of this interdependence of terms and concepts on each other, meaning is necessarily unstable. It's impossible to isolate either one of those terms from each other. And trying to do so, it's as if the other one sort of slips away as you're examining one of them. And the conclusion of this is that absolute conceptual stability is impossible. There's no way to fix it perfectly. There is no transcendental signifier, no term that's outside this play of difference that can fix meaning absolutely. It's always going to slip away from you in some way. This doesn't mean that there's no meaning at all. Rather, that it means that if you are looking at a key concept, say in philosophy, and trying to clarify its meaning, the more intently you study it, the less certain you become about what it means actually, because it seems to draw increasingly on terms and concepts that don't really seem properly to belong to it. And one of the ways Derrida explains how this works is through his famous phrase from his path-breaking book of grammatology. In French, it's "Il n'y a pas de hors texte." Forgive my accent. Literally, there is no outside the text. There's nothing that's outside this play of textuality. But it also kind of, typically in a Derridian mode, it's kind of a pun, because an hors texte in French is that set of pages that are unpaginated in a book, either because there's no text on them at all, or because there's a plate on them, a picture that doesn't have a page number, and so on. And he's saying there are no pages in the play of texts that are unnumbered, that don't belong to the play of textuality. There is no way to get outside of the way that meanings depend upon other meanings for meaning. And if you're trying to figure out what something means in a pure and rigorous sense, you're always going to fail in some way. This becomes signally important when you're thinking about the relationship, say, between human and animal, between language and not language, between reason and irrationality. So let me illustrate the complexity of what Derrida is doing through an exploration of the title of this chapter. It's L'animal que donc je suis à suivre in French, the animal that therefore I am, more to follow in the standard translation. This is first of all, a play on Descartes. cogito ergo sum in Latin, I think, therefore I am, the foundational statement of Enlightenment rationality, which locates the human subject in its relationship to its own thoughts, entirely isolated from everything else. Derrida's rephrasing of that links the human fundamentally to the animal in a way that destabilizes both the concept of human and animal, and indeed thinking, I should say. But it's also a pun. It's a play on the French je suis, I am, which is from the infinitive verb être, but also the French je suis, I follow, which is from the infinitive verb suivre. Je suis, I am, or I follow, spelled the same way, pronounced the same way. And you have to tell them apart, really, by context clues. So this title could be translated as the animal that therefore I am, or the animal that therefore I follow. And then there's that phrase, à suivre, which means to be continued, but it literally means to be followed. When Derrida is talking about Heidegger, a fundamental German philosopher, also incidentally, perhaps not incidentally, a Nazi, in his thinking about the animal and how Heidegger says he will treat this point later, Derrida says, whatever remains to be dealt with later will probably remain so forever. From page 22, people will never get to it. And he's generally right about that. And he's fully aware that he's titled his own lecture, ending it with à suivre, saying, I'm never going to be able to finish this. This very exploration cannot be concluded. It's non-finite is a word he uses in the lecture itself. And we can think increasingly about what it means to follow or to be after. What is the temporal or causal relationships between the concept of the human or the animal? Because being after can mean both temporal priority and sequential or even causal secondariness. Being after can mean being first or can mean being second or some way down the line. Does the human exist as a human because it is after in the sense of the animal, in the sense of chasing after it, hunting it, dominating it? And that is how we come to know ourselves as human. Or is the human after the animal in the sense that the animal is somehow foundational to us? We talk about the beast within, the animal within, as something that is the truth of the human being. And we see evolutionary psychologists talk about it this way. And ultimately, the more we examine this question of being after or following in this relationship between human and animal, the more difficult a position we will find ourselves in. It is fathomless. Now, this issue of animal versus human is important because it's foundational to the mainstream philosophical tradition, whereas Derrida says philosophers have always examined what they call the animal, but have never imagined the animal looking at them. There is no philosopher, he says, in the main line of the philosophical tradition that has allowed themselves to be seen by animals, except for the more playful ones, for example, like Michel de Montaigne. So one of the ways he challenges this distinction between human and animal in the philosophical tradition is by coining a word, and that word is l'animot. This is a pun. It's a portmanteau. It's a combination here of two words, of the French l'animal, which means animal, and the French le mot, which means word. So we typically translate this as the animal's word, but we lose a lot in translation because the point of the word is that it sounds bad. It's a grammatical fault is what it sounds like, or a solecism, to use a fancier word. Derrida says, in order not to damage French ears too sensitive to spelling and grammar, I won't repeat the word animal too often. And so he wants the audience to be slightly uncomfortable with it. So here's what's going on. The ending of this word sounds like the French plural, les animaux, animals. M-A-U-X and M-O-T in French are pronounced exactly the same if they're at the end of a word. But it begins with a singular definite article, le, as an L apostrophe, because the word starts with a vowel sound. Think of the French l'homme, which means man, L apostrophe, H-O-M-M-E, where the H is unsounded. So it's a singular definite article with a plural sounding ending. That really should bother somebody whose French is quite correct. And again, he's speaking to a very elevated, very well-educated audience. And so he wants them to hear it as a fault. Why is it a fault? Because the concept of an animal encompassing all non-human animals homogeneously simply doesn't work. It's philosophically indefensible to cluster in beetles and flies and orangutans and sea cucumbers and flounders and bonobos and tapirs and ravens and crows and chickadees all into one clump, and to put humans outside of that, maybe because we're supposedly reasonable, maybe because we supposedly have an immortal soul and they don't, but really in a philosophical sense, it just simply doesn't work. What Derrida does, though, he doesn't say let's eliminate that boundary between humans and non-humans, but rather let's explore how this boundary works. Not to eliminate it, but rather to foliate it, to look at all the various folds that divide us conceptually, historically, and so on. And so he calls for what he calls a limitrophic investigation, a study of what feeds the limit, from that Greek word trophe, which means to feed. So what is it that feeds the limit? And so when you're doing literary analysis and thinking about Derrida's work on animals, you would be investigating some of the same stuff. Something else that's enormously important to me in this chapter is his discussion of Jeremy Bentham and suffering. Derrida writes, "Can they suffer?" asks Bentham, simply yet so profoundly, page 27. And he's quoting here from Jeremy Bentham's An Introduction to the Principles of Morals in Legislation from 1780. He's a utilitarian philosopher. He wants to reduce absolutely the amount of suffering that exists in the world, that is inflicted in the world, and he has this long footnote, which is both about changes in legislation involving enslaved people, and then finally a discussion of animals. And he writes, again, perhaps significantly in a footnote, "It may come one day to be recognized that the number of the legs, the villosity, that is the hairiness of the skin, or the termination of the os sacrum, that is whether there's a tail, are reasons equally insufficient for abandoning a sensitive being to the same fate of suffering, that is. What else is it that should trace the insufferable line? Is it the faculty of reason, or perhaps the faculty of discourse? But a full-grown horse or dog is beyond comparison a more rational, as well as a more conversable animal, than an infant of a day, or a week, or even a month old. But suppose the case were otherwise. What would it avail? The question is not, can they reason, nor can they talk, but can they suffer?" And typically, animals are excluded from the human community because they are believed not to possess reason. And of course, conversely, humans are believed to possess it. But Derrida, later in this book, raises this question, whether what calls itself human has the right rigorously to attribute to man, which means therefore to attribute to himself what he reviews as the animal. Do we indeed have the right to call ourselves rational beings? Does it ever work perfectly? Well, for example, think of what it means to be absolutely rational, to be the kind of person who thinks about everything through cost-benefit analysis, who quantifies everything, who is devoid of emotion. Such people are typically called robots or robotic. They're thought of as monstrous or inhuman. And so if humans are the rational mortal animal, standard definition, to be perfectly rational as a human being is in some fundamental way not to be human at all, to have abandoned something that's chief to us being human. Because indeed, to be human in a colloquial sense, to talk about someone as a very human person or humane person, is to be someone who is emotional, attached, someone who has love, someone who's vulnerable, someone who's very attached to their family, to their children, to the pets, to other people, who can make a joke and take a joke. Typically, for example, in pop culture, in a film, if a character is very, very powerful and they want to quote-unquote humanize that character, what they do is they show them suffering. They show them crying or in pain or in lonely or needing something. They don't show them as hyper-rational. So again, armed with the kind of work that poststructuralism provides us with, we can already challenge the way that distinction, reason, unreason works, even in pop culture. And so we can now return to the question of suffering. What if we put that at the center of our analysis? Well, as Derrida says, this is no longer about a positive capacity. To be able to suffer is in some sense fundamentally a passive thing. It's about being secondary to something else. And what happens if we don't make the belief in presence center to our ethical analysis, but rather the belief in a kind of absence or secondariness? And so now you can start to sense that this shared condition of dependence, of course, should recall Judith Butler's work to you, and it should also suggest, I think, the ethical implications in deconstruction, which looks at the radical inadequacy and dependence of all concepts, and how there's a straight line we can draw between Derrida's earliest work on language and the question of the problem relationship between writing and not writing and presence and absence, and ultimately to his work on the question of suffering. And my last point, where I'm just going to be focusing on Derrida's discussion of Genesis and names from pages 16 to 17 in the chapter. So here is what Derrida says, and I think he gets it wrong. God, he says, has created man in his likeness so that man will subject, tame, dominate, train, or domesticate the animals born before him and assert his authority over them. God destines the animals to an experience of the power of man in order to see the power of man in action, in order to see the power of man at work, in order to see man take power over all living beings. The problem here is I think that Derrida, although he's careful to distinguish the two creation stories in Genesis from one another, seems to collapse the difference between them at this point. And I think he misses the opportunity to do something that's more honestly and paradigmatically Derridian. So to remind you, in Genesis, the very first creation story, man and woman are created simultaneously. They are the last beings created, and they are granted dominion over the fishes of the sea and the fowls of the air and all living creatures that move upon the earth. That's Genesis 1:26 and 1:28. The second story is very, very different. It begins with plants, then Adam is created as a gardener, then the animals are created because God suspects that Adam is lonely and needs a companion, and then because the animals are inadequate companions for Adam, we can say more about that in class, then he creates Eve. And then we have this whole business between Eve, Adam, and the serpent, which sets up gender hierarchy. So if the very first creation story is very much about a hierarchy between human and animal, the second creation story is arguably about a hierarchy between man and woman. Very different commitments in these two stories. So in the second story, we have this very unusual bit that concerns Derrida. And the Lord God, having formed out of the ground all the beasts of the earth and all the fowls of the air, brought them to Adam to see what he would call them. For whatsoever Adam called any living creature, the same is its name. Now, this is not about dominion or domination. It is simply the bestowal of a name. The person who gives a name to you, perhaps in some sense, believes that they are dominating you or subjecting you by giving that to you. But the name can also be your own name. It's something that exists independently of the person who has given it to you. You can even name yourself. And the question is, does the name actually belong to you, though? Because a name can operate even in your absence. We do this, of course, clearly when we sign our names to something, and the name is there to kind of stand in for us. But also a name on a headstone is a sign that we once existed. A name gives us over to that play of presence and absence, which is a feature of language and concepts more generally. A name shows where we are and shows that we will one day not be as well. It belongs to us, but it belongs to the mouth of everyone else who speaks it. They can have their name, our name, in their mouth as well. And so the name is not in any sense a clear signal of domination, at least not when we're doing things in a Derridian analysis. And then this gets really complicated when we're talking about animal names. What did Adam call the animals? Well, God was a little surprised, and I think Derrida is right to be interested in that moment. But he probably doesn't call them by personal names. When that cow came before him, he didn't say, "Hello, Steve." He said, "Hello, cow," and so on. And so when you're naming an animal, you are naming them generally on the basis of species. which is different than a proper name. A proper name is marking a mortal being, something that is and then will eventually not be. A species name is marking a kind of general category of things which exist in perpetuity, at least if you don't believe in extinction, which the writers of Genesis probably did not. And so one thing I would like to do in class is to talk about the way that an animal name differs from a human name, and the way that an animal name is different from l'animot. How is this story in Genesis 2 something different from the philosophical tradition of talking about the animal in general? I'm looking forward to our conversation.